Mr. President, I listened carefully this morning to the statement made by the Republican Majority Leader, and I was a little bit curious as to what he was trying to say, because he talked about a judicial nominee who was rated unanimously well qualified by the American Bar Association, who received kudos from liberals and Democrats alike, including members of the Senate, went through the Senate without a hitch, and then he couldn't understand why there'd be more questions asked now for another appointment. I was puzzled. I thought he was talking about Merrick Garland. We remember him, don't we? Merrick Garland was, of course, President Obama's nominee to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court. Senator McConnell this morning said repeatedly, so what's changed since the first time that Judge Gorsuch came before the Senate? Senator McConnell, what's changed is you. What you did when Merrick Garland's name was sent. For the first time ever in the history of the United States Senate, you, Senator McConnell, denied a hearing and a vote to a presidential nominee for the Supreme Court. Never happened before, not once in history. And if you think, well, maybe the Democrats didn't have a chance to show the same steel will, the same political determination. In the last year of his presidency, Ronald Reagan nominated Anthony Kennedy to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court. He sent that nomination down to the Senate. I believe Senator Biden was the chair of the Judiciary Committee at the time. There was a Democratic majority. On the last year of the Reagan presidency, the so-called lame duck year by Senator McConnell's description, the Democratic majority in the Senate gave President Reagan the respect of honoring his constitutional responsibility to fill that vacancy, sent Anthony Kennedy to serve on the Supreme Court. So Senator McConnell asks, what's changed? He's changed. He's changed the Senate. And here's the good news for him. We are not going to forswear our own demands that a presidential nominee for the Supreme Court is deserving of a hearing and a vote. I said that over and over again when Merrick Garland was being stonewalled by Senator McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate. And I'll say it again. I do believe the president's nominee has the right to a hearing and a vote. That nominee also has a responsibility to show us that he's not only qualified to serve on an important appellate court, but to serve with a lifetime appointment to the highest court of the land. On Tuesday night, President Trump announced he would nominate 10th Circuit Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. It's important to put that nomination in context. This is not a run-of-the-mill nomination. It's an extraordinary time in America's history. President Trump's announcement was actually supposed to happen today. Why was it sped up? Why did they hurry it up? Well, because of the avalanche of criticism being heaped on the Trump administration for their executive orders on refugees and immigrations. They had to change the subject. After dozens of legal immigrants were detained at airports all over the weekend, solely because of their country of origin, including children, seniors, interpreters who helped our troops, federal courts stepped in to block the president's executive order. Mr. President, we've done some research, we're going to do some more. We think this is the first time in the history of the United States a new president, within the first 10 days, had an executive order stopped by the federal courts. It shows you how controversial that order was, that the federal courts would step in with this brand new president and say, stop. This has to be carefully weighed as to whether it's legal or constitutional. And then on Friday, the unprecedented firing of an attorney general who refused to defend President Trump's unlawful executive order in court. President Trump moved up his Supreme Court announcement to try to change the headlines. In doing so, he made even more clear how critical it is that we have an independent judicial system, not a rubber stamp for the president. Especially vital at this moment in our history. Excuse me. President Trump and his agenda are likely to come before the Supreme Court eventually. From his violations of the Constitution's Emolument Clause to his unprecedented executive actions, President Trump is likely to keep the High Court busy. We need justices on that court who are truly independent. President Trump's announcement also came 10 months and 15 days after a White House announcement about another Supreme Court nominee I mentioned earlier, Judge Merrick Garland, perhaps the most well-qualified mainstream independent nominee to come before the Senate. Merrick Garland, a son of Illinois, a good man, outstanding judge. Judge Gorsuch himself once described Judge Merrick Garland as, quote, among the finest lawyers of this generation. But Merrick Garland was subjected to unprecedented obstruction by Senate Republicans and Senator McConnell. Republican senators simply ignored their constitutional responsibility to consider this nomination for political reasons. It was worse than any filibuster. Do you remember the time when Senator McConnell and a number of others in the leadership said they would not even meet with the president's nominee, would not even give him the courtesy of a meeting? Merrick Garland was the first Supreme Court nominee in our nation's history to be denied any consideration by the Senate. No hearing, no vote, nothing. It was shameful. I took an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution. Every senator does, and to bear true faith and allegiance to it. I take it seriously. And even though my Republican colleagues chose to ignore their responsibilities when it came to filling that Supreme Court vacancy in election year, I do believe that we have a constitutional responsibility to give Judge Gorsuch a hearing and a vote. I will do my due diligence as a senator and give his nomination fair consideration. That is what the advice and consent responsibility in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution requires. If my Republican colleagues complain about the process for Judge Gorsuch, just remember, no one ran a worse process on a Supreme Court nominee than my Republican colleagues themselves did for Merrick Garland. They really have no right to complain. Now that President Trump has nominated Judge Gorsuch, senators will embark on a thorough review of his record. He was confirmed to the 10th Circuit in 2006, but the level of scrutiny is far higher for Supreme Court nominees and lifetime appointments to that court. He now has a lengthy judicial record, which we will review carefully. There are parts of his record that already raise questions, maybe concerns. In recent years, we have watched the Supreme Court transform into a corporate court, where all too often cases seem to break for the big corporations, regularly against the little guy. We need a Supreme Court that gives the American people a fair shot against corporate elites, corporate special interest. Judge Gorsuch's record as a judge and an advocate raises concerns as to whether he would hasten that trend. I note that yesterday, Reuters published an article entitled, quote, as private lawyer, Trump High Court pick was a friend to business. The article said that while Judge Gorsuch was in private practice, he often fought on behalf of business interests, including efforts to curb securities class action lawsuits, experience that can mold his thinking if he's confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. And during the time on the bench, Judge Gorsuch appears to have a consistent pattern of favoring companies over workers in cases involving employment discrimination, worker safety, and other matters. That's why we need to carefully review his record. Judge Gorsuch also must answer important questions about his views and records on issues of fundamental importance to American people. Our right to privacy. Is there anything more important? Almost on a daily basis, we are being asked if we're ready to give up a little more of our privacy. We know that corporate interests and business interests are collecting data on us. You find it every time you log onto the internet, and there is this cascade of ads on the side of the page asking you if you want to buy something that you just happened to have bought a couple months ago. We know as well that that information is being cataloged carefully and being used by business interests to promote their products and to categorize us as Americans. We also believe, I think, there are even some Republicans who believe, that individuals have a right of privacy when it comes to the overreach of the federal government and when it comes to critical decisions so important to our personal lives. At that last heartbreaking moment, when a family has to decide about the medical care for someone who is nearing death, is that going to be subject to a court order, or is that going to be a decision made in the privacy of a family? At that moment, when a family faces the pregnancy of a teenage girl in the household, is that a family decision, or is that a decision where government has the last word? The Supreme Court decides that, and we need to ask Judge Gorsuch what he thinks and understand clearly what he says. We also believe that when it comes to our security, not just our privacy, but our security, the Supreme Court time and again will have the last word. when it comes to issue of safety, health, environmental protection? Where will this new Supreme Court nominee be? Is he going to bend toward the corporate interest and look the other way as we face climate change, the pollution of streams, contamination of our drinking water, dangers in our public health? If he is going to rule consistently for the corporate interest, no matter what, he certainly doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, represent the values we need on the Supreme Court. He needs to answer questions as well about immigration, privacy, campaign finance, and voting rights. Like Justice Scalia, Judge Gorsuch professes to be an originalist. Let me stick with that for a moment. I've been on the Judiciary Committee for quite a few years. Time and again, whether it's the nominee for Attorney General or nominees for the high courts, here is the cliche that we're given. We are just going to apply the rule of law. Whatever the law says, that's what we do. We are originalist. I call that the robotic view of justice, that if you just plug in the facts, a computer can tell you the answer, because the computer compares them to the law, and yet we know better. We know that judges make decisions based on a variety of concerns, and they weigh some facts more carefully and give some facts more strength than others. This rule of law robotic justice is a fiction. We know that each nominee, whether from a Democrat or a Republican, brings views to the court that will decide how many cases will lean. Judge Gorsuch has to answer questions forthrightly. There's a cottage industry of teaching nominees to give thoughtful non-answers to important questions. That won't cut it for me and for many of my colleagues. The American people want honest, candid candidates for the bench. We know Judge Gorsuch is the handpicked nominee of President Trump and has been lauded by right-wing organizations all over the United States. They hope he'll be a dependable vote in their favor. But he has to demonstrate to the others, to me, to many senators, that he'd be prepared to even disappoint the right wing if the Constitution and the law required it. Since the confirmation of Justice Clarence Thomas in 1991, Supreme Court justices have had to show they could pass the threshold of 60 votes to get confirmed. I expect nothing less from this nominee. Justice Elena Kagan, nominated by President Obama, received 63 votes. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, nominated by President Obama, received 68 votes. Justice Sam Alito had a cloture vote where he received 72 votes, subsequently 58 votes for his actual confirmation. Justice Roberts, 78 votes. Justice Breyer, 87. Justice Ginsburg, 96. Judge Gorsuch has a burden to bear. He has to demonstrate that he is a nominee who will uphold and defend the Constitution for the benefit of all of us, not just the advantage of a privileged few. I take my constitutional responsibility very seriously when it comes to the Supreme Court. And as a member of the Judiciary Committee, I'm preparing questions to ask the nominee. It's going to take some time, it usually does, several months, but my Republican colleagues have kept this seat vacant since February of last year. So they don't have any basis for arguing and complaining that we just have to move on this really fast. I'm sorry that we're not considering the nomination of Merrick Garland, an eminently qualified mainstream judge who deserved better treatment than he received from Senate Republicans and Senator McConnell. No one deserves the treatment that Merrick Garland received. With my oath to support and defend the Constitution firmly in mind, I will consider, advise, and consent on Judge Gorsuch's nomination. I'll strive to be thorough, fair, and focused on the important principles I've discussed today, and I yield the floor.